Some of the content contained in this podcast may prove challenging to some listeners. Discretion is advised. Please contact a member of your local support group or a relevant and accredited support organisation if affected and help is required. Hello, and welcome to My Service, My Story, Vietnam, a collaborative podcast between the Warragul RSL and the Warragul and Druin Gazette. My name is Nicholas Duck. I'm a journalist for the Warragul and Druin Gazette, and joining me today is Vietnam veteran and Druin local Keith Anderson. Keith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you very much for agreeing to join us. We're going to dive straight in. We're going to talk about all of your experiences from the past, your experiences in Vietnam, all that sort of thing. So I hope you're all ready to go.
Fine.
All right. Well, we'll start from the very start. So if you could begin by talking to us about your childhood a bit, where you grew up, where you went to school, sort of your movements prior to serving in the ADF.
I was born and bred locally here. I lived at Druin for my formative years, if we call it that. I left Druin firstly by sale in about 1973, late 1973, then to Brisbane, and was in Queensland for 13 years up until 1988.
So that was after your service in Vietnam then?
Yeah. Then I returned to Victoria to work in Melbourne and semi-retired or whatever, back to Druin. We still had family around that area.
So what about just prior to your service in Vietnam? What were your actions there? Where were you? So how old were you when you were first conscripted, first of all?
Well, I was conscripted at 20 years of age, but I didn't go into the army until I was 22 and a half. I got 2 years deferment. I was doing a 4-year journalism cadetship when I was conscripted, and I got deferred for 2.5 years, went into the army mid-1969.
Yeah, okay. So where was your cadetship at the time?
At the Warragul Gazette.
Where you now remain to this day. There you go. Old habits die hard. So on that, you were a conscript into the ADF, as many, many people were. What was that like, being a young 20-year-old and being conscripted into national service?
It was something you preferred not to have happen because you were at that stage of life where you're starting to, in your career, as I was in halfway through a cadetship in journalism, and quite a few others, university students got deferred, things like that. If you had, had an official training program, a registered training program. So, yeah, it got deferred. I'm not sure of the exact number, but I think it was about 1 in a dozen or so 20-year-olds actually got conscripted. The thing that probably annoyed us most at the time was we were 20 when we had to register, and the voting age wasn't until 21, which was interesting thing.
So where were you in life when you were conscripted? I know you said you were doing your cadetship. Were you living out of home? Were you in a relationship at the time? What was going on?
No, I was living out of home. One of the things I remember at work, I got a phone call from my mother to say, I've got a letter from the army. Boom, I went home and opened up the letter and said, dear Mr. Anderson, I'd like to advise you have been successful in the National Service ballot.
Right.
And my idea of being successful and the Army's idea of being successful were dead set opposite.
Well, how did you feel when you were conscripted? Was there a sense of nerves? Was it a scary prospect?
It was a time when it was a very divisive political situation in Australia about Australia's involvement. But that didn't faze me. It was just, if you go into the army, what can I do? Like the last thing I want to do was be in the infantry, and that's where I finish up.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's skip forward ahead a bit to that service. Once you got underway at age 22, what did you do first? Where did you go for training? What was training like?
Well, training was 10 weeks recruit training, and that was at Puckapunyal for Victorians, Tasmanians, South Australians, a few from Western Australia. The others were in New South Wales, another training battalion there. It was different. It was at Puckapunyal in central Victoria, which has got to be about the coldest place in Australia in the winter, and I went in July.
Peak time for it.
Yeah, and it was always up well before dark. They come and rouse you up to make you pull your bed to pieces, so you had to remake it and carry the sheets outside and go on a parade.
Yeah, okay. Well, what did your average day of training look like? I mean, obviously you hear stories of sort of, you know, the stereotypical strict commanding officer and all that sort of thing. Is that sort of true to your experience or not?
Oh, I don't know. You know, strict. You were part of a large group, a large team, and for a large team you got to have uniform practices to operate effectively, and that's basically what it was about. I didn't find at any stage, well, could be physically tough in a lot of instances, not so much at recruit training, but when I got out doing pre-Vietnam training, it was physically tough, it was mentally tough, but without it, yeah.
Did you feel physically up to it at the time? Were you fit enough, or did you sort of have to adjust yourself on the fly?
They sort of work hard on your physical stuff. Yeah, I wouldn't say I or most of the people went in there, you know, as if we could go and play a full game of footy without any worries. Yeah.
Did you come out of it feeling prepared at all? I mean, obviously it's hard to visualise exactly what you were going to be getting into once you arrived in Vietnam, but did you come out with a sense of confidence?
Oh, yeah. Once we were there, once I'd completed what was core training, which we did with the battalion, and then also took part in battalion exercises, company exercises from North Queensland to into northern New South Wales, and it was tough. But I went straight from rookies to the battalion, which was unusual. Usually went to an official infantry corps training, which was done in New South Wales, but they were rebuilding troop numbers in the 2nd Battalion, which was due to go to Vietnam in May the next year. So if we'd have done the corps training in Sydney, it wouldn't have given us sufficient time preparation with the battalion. So they selected, again, another lottery.
Yeah, another lottery.
Yeah, they selected, I don't know the numbers there either, but just a few out of, it was probably, I think, out of my recruit platoon, which was about 55, 56 people, I think there were only 4 of us who went to Townsville to join the 2nd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment.
Right, so you were lucky 2 times in a row, according to
I was fast
according to the force. Yeah, there you go, a man of many talents. So in that, once you went over to Vietnam, I mean, tell us a bit about your service history. You went over as an infantryman, and for people who don't know what that is, I guess, do you want to talk about your role, what it was like when you first arrived, and what was expected of you as an infantryman?
Well, infantry is really the Army's feet on the ground, and do the patrols and, you know, what they were called in Vietnam when I was here was search and destroy missions, search out for enemy, be it regular North Vietnamese Army or the Viet Cong, which was, you know, basically a local revolutionary force from South Vietnam. So, it was patrols back in camp a little bit, mainly out in the field, which in the field could be anything from going around the buns on rice paddies to out in open country to jungle to rubber plantations to dense tropical rainforest. which was always the hardest place to go because that was usually in mountainous type areas.
Well, just going back a little, you sort of painted a picture for me there. Before going to Vietnam, had you actually left Australia before, or was this the first time you'd left the country?
No, I'd been to New Zealand to visit relatives on one side of the family over there. But yeah, no, I was a country boy. Yeah, trips to Melbourne in those days were not very regular, a couple of times a year to catch up with relatives.
Well, what did you notice, I guess, most of all when you first arrived in Vietnam? What struck you as being something that really remains in your memory, something that stuck out maybe compared to Australia?
Well, my first sight of Vietnam was through an aeroplane window, and I was fortunate enough to travel to Vietnam by a plane on both occasions, not by boat.
Yeah.
So I was fortunate, but my first sight of Vietnam was flying over the Mekong River Delta. And I'd never seen anything like it, and it seemed to take ages for us to even fly over the delta. It was that big, and that was my first thing. Then we got down, landed at Saigon at Ton Sa Nu Airport, got off the plane, we made to sit on the tarmac beside the plane for what seemed like hours in a fair bit of heat before then got on a transport plane to fly to Nui Dat, where we were based, where the core of Australia's forces were based.
Well, tell me a little bit about Nui Dat. Obviously, there were a lot of Australians going to and from it at all times. What was it like being there?
It was an army camp.
Yeah.
The only difference, we'd gone from old Second World War II huts at Puckapunyal to what seemed like really nice modern accommodation at Townsville, where the battalion was based and is still based, and then to Nui Dat, where we were in four-man tents, sandbag four-man tents. So they had a bit different accommodation to get to, but it was it's an army base, an army camp, and nothing that I wasn't not expecting.
So you weren't too fazed by the accommodation and the conditions there?
No, you just lived in a lot worse conditions when we got out in the field.
When you arrived in Nui Dat, did you know anyone there? Was there anyone that you'd been trained with who came along with you?
Yeah, we'd been together since late September till May before we went to Vietnam. So you get to know the blokes. We were in what was called a Carter company, a training company, with the battalion. And there was about, 45 of us, I suppose. You got to know those blokes pretty well, as you did others once you got more involved with the company and the battalion.
Now, what unit did you serve with?
2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, stroke New Zealand. We 2RA, 4RA and 6RA as referred to. In short, were Anzac battalions in Vietnam, and a lot of people in Australia never realised New Zealanders were there. But yeah, so it was 3 companies of Australia and 2 companies from New Zealand made up the battalion.
Well, I'll be honest, from my perspective, I wasn't aware that Anzac battalions were a thing in Vietnam either, so, that's a bit of new information for me. Well, tell me a bit about that, what it was like, I guess, being alongside these blokes from New Zealand as well as Australia. What was that like? Did you get along all right?
Didn't have massive amounts to do with them. They were all regular soldiers who'd spent several months, I think, in Malaya, training, I'd imagine, in the tropical conditions, which don't exist where they come from, before going on to Vietnam. And I suppose, in summary, what I'd say about the Kiwis is that I was glad they were on our side and not the other side.
Yeah. What do you sort of mean by that?
They were tough soldiers.
Yeah.
Yeah. They weren't guys who, 12 months earlier or 6 months earlier were, working in a shop or an office or something like that. And I suppose one of the things in the group that I found the guys who'd grown up in the country were a lot more adaptable to the change to the army than guys who came from the city. Because, if you're in the country, you beat about the bush a bit and you climb trees and gum trees and various other things which the city kids never did. You probably had more risk in your life with some of your activities.
Probably a bit better than, kids of today with their TV and all their technology.
And phones.
No, of course. Well, let's just dive straight into what it was like as an infantryman. Talk to me a bit about what a typical day was like for yourself, out and about, out in the bush. Paint me a picture of what it looked like.
I don't think there was any such thing as a typical day.
Right.
Right, you got your instructions from the day each morning. And they could alter. You might go on an operation that's going to take 2 or 3 weeks. And you're going to go from A to B via C, D, E and F. But then intelligence gathering, etc. may provide the unit with other information that you've got to change direction or something like that. So sort of that was, I suppose, one of my most vivid memories out in the bush. And let's forget war stuff, because we were on an operation to go up this mountain range, and we're supposed to get to the top in one day, which they found out, whoever worked it out, looking at the maps and the contours and whatever, it was a bit of a hard ask. And when we got onto this mountain, it was even harder, and we'd arrived in Vietnam just at the start of the wet season, the monsoon season, so it got pretty wet, and I think we never made it to the top in the one day because it was very rocky, very slippery, which a map doesn't tell you all those.
No, of course not.
And we didn't make it to the top that day, and then at night it just poured down. We had little hutchies, little sort of vinyl type fold up thing that you used as a one-man tent. We could do 2 together to make them 2-man tent, and it just rained so hard and a lot of rocky stuff, and the water came off those rocks like cascades. Just went straight through the hutchies and just sat there. It was probably one of the longest nights of my life, just getting absolutely soaked. Every bit of gear you had got soaked, and of course water and your rifles aren't a good mix.
Yeah.
And so that was a real issue again the next morning, was making sure all our weapons were in working order. And we carried a fair amount of gear too. I think my kit all up with ammunition and hand grenades and rations and various other things, water bottles, which were very heavy, was at least equal to my body weight. So it was pretty tough going, but I remember that night very well.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm guessing you don't forget a night like that. I mean, just adding to that though, I mean, not only the weather conditions, but the fact that you're deep in what is essentially enemy territory. I mean, that must have been
Yeah, well, that was the deal. You knew, of course, the whole thing, the major things you needed were, one, a bit of discipline to do your job. You can't do everybody else's job. It's just everybody doing their role for the unit, for the team, and common sense is the other thing. So I'd just say those are 2 key things for the soldiers in the field. Tiredness, physically, you get tired, and probably one of the hardest things you ever had to do out bush after a hard day's physical work, particularly driving in heavily vegetated areas, was then you'd get rostered on for guard duty during the night, manning a machine gun, 2 at a time. And sometimes if you had a drop in numbers in your section, you do it by sections, which are about 12 was probably an official number, but you never had 12 out in the field for various reasons. So sometimes I think one night had a 4-hour shift, so you hardly had any sleep, and you're up to man the gun for 4 hours and trying every trick in the book that you wouldn't go to sleep, because that was almost a capital offence, going to sleep on guard duty, and then you try and get another couple of hours sleep before you're up before sunrise.
So we'll talk a bit about the people that you did serve with, because obviously being out in those sorts of conditions, I mean, you'd have to have developed some pretty close relationships out there. Do you want to tell me a bit about what it was like being out there with all those blokes?
The relationships really become enormous. It's quite difficult to really say. Like, I'd played in a lot of sporting teams. I've played in a lot of premiership teams and representative teams, etc. And you make good bonds and lifelong friends there, but it was not like the bond that the Army's created. And that's something which, as time has gone on, and it's now 50, 60 years nearly since Australia left Vietnam, those bonds, I appreciate that even more than I have over the years. I didn't have anything to do with veterans organisations or anything like that until pretty late. The turning point, I didn't go to the Welcome Home Parade in Sydney. I was living in Queensland then. But I did finish up going to the unveiling of the memorial in Canberra, just on the avenue up to the War Memorial, and we had a great time together. People came from every corner of Australia, and we got together, and out of that flowed, and that was the early 1990s, and out of that flowed a couple of guys chasing down everybody. At the time when we were there, yes, got phone numbers and addresses and all that stuff, but there were quite a few who didn't make it. They tracked down, and then a few years later we held our first reunion as a platoon, and we continued every 2 years at different spots in Australia, from
there you go,
from Port Lincoln to Phillip Island to Canberra to Brisbane and wherever. We had them. We held our last one in 1972. Simple reason, numbers were dwindling. Either people had died or got to that stage where they couldn't travel, or their partners couldn't travel, or something like that. So we finished those, but you keep your close connections, and one of the closest connections I've got is, and we contact each other regularly, is a guy who lives in Gove in the Northern Territory.
Oh, there you go.
And we catch up every couple of years somewhere. He'll travel down to somewhere, and I've got others you keep in touch with, and we have now through social media various links, and so you keep the pace with people. But more than half the people who served in Vietnam are now dead. So we're all getting old. The other thing about Vietnam, and I think of, is the other services. The kid I started school with in grade 1 at Druin was in the Navy and served on craft that went to and from Vietnam. Another guy from Warragul who I knew extremely well at Warragul, he was in the Air Force, and we were getting picked up by chopper from an operation at some stage. And I jumped up into the chopper, and as I was climbing up, and they never actually landed on the ground. It was always hard with your packs and rifle to try and get on a chopper, just putting your foot on the base there, which was about 3 foot off the ground, and then getting another couple of feet into the chopper. That's back in imperial measurement days, not these days, but let's say a bit under a metre. And and whatever with 3 feet. But and this guy who's manning a machine gun in the chopper, a guy named Stephen Milstead from Warragul, he just said, "Hey, what the hell are you doing there?" And anyway, he unfortunately got killed in a training accident a couple of years later when the chopper crashed in South Australia. But, you know, there were local guys from other services who were involved in Vietnam too.
Yeah, that's incredible that you managed to run into someone that you knew just like that. I mean, what are the chances of that, really?
I don't know. He certainly wasn't expecting me, and I wasn't expecting him.
No, of course. Well, I just want to go back, I guess, to your service. I think I just wanted to ask, I guess, on a more serious note, you're out there, there are obviously instances where you do get into combat. Had you ever held a gun or fired a gun before you went over?
No.
No.
And it's like a lot of things. When they asked you that question, you know, and that was at recruit training, the first time we actually fired a weapon, and anyone who's been shooting, the question you ask, you know, folks would throw their hands up, you know, and who hasn't fired a rifle? And a few would look around, and I'd put my hand up. I said, "Good, we'll teach you how to do it properly," and which is correct.
Yeah, of course. Well, once you got over there and you were holding your gun and you were, I'm guessing at times you had to use it, you know, in a situation where you feared potentially for your life. I mean, what is that like? I can't even picture that for myself. So for yourself, I mean, what was that experience like?
You were trained for it. You were well trained for it.
Mm.
You know, but also I didn't, you know, say, "Oh, this is going to be horrible or terrible or I'm scared," or stuff like that. You're trained for it. If a certain situation arises, your role in your team was to do various things. You did that.
Yeah, play your role.
Yeah, but we lost 3 from our platoon during the course there, and quite a few others who had sort of life-affecting injuries and wounds.
Mm.
But it wasn't a real emotion thing out there. If somebody got hit, you know, that's it. If somebody gets hit, if we get attacked, there are various actions you take as a unit. So those things swung into action. I'd say we were extremely well trained, you know, for guys who, particularly the conscript who was dragged off the street.
That's just, again, it's just a very interesting perspective for me because I'm 26. I'm 4 years older than you were when you went over there, and I just can't imagine being in that sort of situation. So I guess to hear it from you and just say, well, you know, it's just what you did. It's just, that's just an incredible thing to me personally, at least, to think about. You know, what would I have been like at age 22 in that situation? Because, I mean, to be frank, I don't think I could have been as calm and collected as you might have been.
You would have been.
Well, I like your faith.
You would have been with the training that you underwent.
Yeah.
You know, it's an old saying which is so appropriate, and it is what it is.
No, well, I appreciate the faith in me nonetheless. Well, that was more the physical side of it. I wanted to talk, or touch on at least, I guess, the mental toll. Homesickness, I'm guessing, would have been something that people in your platoon would have struggled with. I don't know whether you personally would have dealt with it.
Well, again, homesickness, no point being homesick because you're not going to be going there anytime soon.
Yeah.
So that was, that never came to play for me. I don't think to a degree at all. It's not homesickness. And you don't reflect on things when you're there, really. That's when you're home in later years. I reflect more on the time in Vietnam probably now than I did there. And things, I had an instance at that last reunion we had in 2022, last platoon reunion. And the second platoon commander that I had, the first one got badly injured in Vietnam. And the second one, he tracked down a woman who was living in Western Sydney, who was the daughter of one of our guys got killed, but she hadn't been born when he got killed.
Oh, right.
So she never knew her father. And he tracked her down, and she had 2 daughters, teenage daughters. She'd have been 50 then. And we all chipped in and brought them to Brisbane for the reunion.
Yeah.
And it made me think back to my mother, for example. And thousands and thousands of people have gone through this, When my father went off to World War II, Mum's got a baby in arms, and Dad was in the Navy and spent time in European waters as well as Pacific towards the end, but not much time home. And then has me, the baby, when the war was over, and then she sees her son going off. So, plenty of mothers were in that situation, and plenty of brothers and sisters, and because we've lost a lot. I looked at a book on local stuff, and a number of people just in World War One. I think it was 460 odd from what is now Baw Shire, who were killed in World War One from this area. And you add on World War Two, Vietnam. The only one I know who was local, he came from Bunyip, was bloke I went to school with too, at high school, John Tinkham, who worked at the then Bull Shire offices. And he's the only local bloke I know that got killed.
Do you think the fact that your father did serve in World War II changed your perspective on how you approach things when you were conscripted? Do you think sort of that memory of your father serving changed the way that maybe you thought about?
Well, I had no memory of my father serving, but he did get heavily involved with the Return Services League when he came back and was in. And the Christmas party the RSL in Druin used to throw for the kids was highlight of the year. And you look back, I knew a lot of those people through my father's connections. He became friends with a family connection. A lot of those World War II guys, and I think we had about half a dozen ex-prisoners of war living in Druin. And you can imagine what they'd have gone through. Yet they became highly successful people. Most of them did. I think there was one of them was in a state where I don't think he ever worked or could ever work, but the others ran local businesses, very successful local businesses, and just got on with life, which is what you got to do.
Well, we'll talk about the end of your service now. When you did come up to the end of your tour, how did you feel knowing that you were about to go home?
Oh, yeah, well, that's good. We've been here. We've done what was asked of us. What the people of Australia asked of you, which is in effect. And you got home, and that was it. And you got discharged, and and you got discharged, and that was it. Back to normal life. I think I had a week off after getting out of the army and starting back in civilian life, because our jobs were officially protected. Your employer had to take you back on when you came. Your employer you had the day before you went in the army had to take you on virtually the day after you got out.
What was that like, stepping back into civilian life? Was it something that, did your experiences in Vietnam change the way you approach things once you returned, or was it just get on with it?
Well, I was looking forward to getting back into work, but I think whether it changed me or not, other people are better judges than that. Certainly, I think my army time has influenced a little bit of my thinking post there. Has changed me in ways for the better, hopefully. It was about it for what you did with your life. You got on, you had your own family, and You know, my son then decides, my only son then decides he's going to join the Defence Force, and he did, and was a pilot in the Air Force, and yeah.
How did you feel about that when he joined? Did you feel proud? Or?
Oh, yeah, it's a very hard position. I think they were taking for pilot training around about 80 a year. They used to get something like 5,000 applicants. 80 a year, and if they had 80, I know on my son's course he had, I think it started out at 26 on his course, and for pilot training, which went for about 18 months, and I think graduation there was 15.
Right.
So it's pretty tough to get through. He got through, but his interest, I don't think, was so much in the Defence Force, but he had a fascination with aeroplanes. And I remember when we were living in Queensland and we'd fly back down here to visit family or come down for Christmas or whatever, he'd always want to sit at the window seat, not to look at the countryside, but even above the clouds, he looked at the movement of the wings and how that changed what was going on inside the plane, how you felt. He just had that. And I think he was 14, he come to me, he said, I want to be a pilot in the Air Force. I said, go for it. And he went for it, and it was hard work to get selected, but he got there.
Well, just on going back a bit to your return back to Australia. Now, Vietnam as a war, as I understand it, was not a very popular one at the time, which may be underselling things really.
Yeah.
And I know, talking to people from their experience coming back, there was maybe a backlash towards the soldiers that had returned. Did you feel that at all? How did you feel coming back?
I never caught that personally, but I know others who have. The welcome home parade supposedly in Sydney had a lot of that for the troops that had returned. And close to me, that guy was in my section. He was 2IC in my section, which is only about 10 or 12 people.
Sorry, what does that mean?
He was 2IC, second in charge.
Oh, second in charge, yeah.
Lance Corporal. And good bloke, really good soldier. And he was in a hotel with a group of mates somewhere where he was living post-army. And I don't know whether it was any special event, but some guy just said to him, who was in the pub too, drinking, said, not amongst the group that my mate was with, but must have overheard something mention of Vietnam, and he said, you're all a heap of baby killers. Well, my friend just lost it, and he was quite strong, not a huge bloke, but strong, big shoulders, very fit, and he apparently took to this guy and bashed him within an inch of his life and finished up doing quite a lengthy period in jail for that. And he's not wanted to connect with any guys in the platoon at all because of that. But but it was. I personally have not experienced any of those things.
Well, how do you feel about it personally? Your own service, I suppose. Do you feel a sense of pride? How do you reflect on it all these years later? Pride.
I don't know if that's the right word. I think it comes down to your appreciation of the people you are with, and all those who've gone before you in similar or even worse circumstances. I've got a hell of a lot better appreciation for any ex-service person and current serving people. We don't show it greatly in Australia, not like, for example, in America. Where if you're an ex-service person or a serving person particularly, the community that you might be in or based in looks after you very well, whereas we don't do that. And I think one of the best things people could do, and certainly the tabling recently, or the release recently of the veterans' deaths by suicide report, and it's 122 recommendations. And there is a fair bit of suicide. 2 blokes I served within my platoon of suicide post-Vietnam, whether it was, they had personal issues on top of any issues they may have had from Vietnam, I don't know. But a couple of suicided out of, 30 odd of us, which is a pretty high rate. But I think, people just go up, see a bloke in uniform or a bloke wearing medals, just shake his hand, say thanks.
Yeah. So you think we as a country could be doing a much better job, I suppose, showing reverence to those who have served?
Yeah.
Well, moving forward to today, and your, I guess, involvement with the local RSL, I understand that it took you a while to get over the line to come down to an RSL. Is that the case?
Yeah, 50 years.
Yeah.
That was brought about when I got back from Vietnam. A good family friend who'd been secretary of the Druin RSL for many, many years came up to me and said, you're back. He said, how about coming up to the RSL on next Friday night? I used to play billiards and whatever up there, and he said, we'll induct you into the RSL. You're the first father-son World War II Vietnam potential member that they had, you see. I said, yeah, that sounds good. He said, you won't be classed as a returned serviceman, you'll be an associate. And I said, why? He said, well, that's the way it's looked at. Vietnam's not like the world wars. And I remember going home, telling my father, and he just sort of looked at me, because he was still heavily involved in the RSL, but virtually, and he never told me the reason why, but after then, he changed his focus from the RSL to legacy. He became a really strong worker for legacy. We weren't accepted. It's only when World War II people started dying off, or they were dying off all the time, but to a large degree, and RSL numbers were dwindling, that they eventually decided to include us.
Do you know why they would have done that? Why Vietnam wasn't held in the same regard as those other wars?
Well, it was really a civil war in a lot of respects between the top half of the north of Vietnam and the southern part, and they were, north was governed by the communist regime, and the south, which was democratic, but there were different sorts of democracies, and I don't think it was all that honourable a democracy. There were also a lot of non-Asian business interests in Vietnam, the rubber plantations particularly, which were, I suppose, being in South Vietnam, being dependent, not being taken over by a communist regime.
And what about now? What, I guess, got you over the line to
the RSL?
Participate in the RSL, yeah.
Well, a lot of RSLs, even now, are dwindling. The Vietnam guys are dying off. But what was going on at the Warragul RSL that I saw when they were starting programs for veterans, for fitness, for other things, hobby type things, and every day of the week at the Warragul RSL is some activity on for veterans and their wives, widows, and all those types of things, and more so for young kids, and also involving other things like first responder groups. I think the average policeman would see a lot worse things than we saw in Vietnam. And they don't get the recognition either.
Have you thought about, getting your story out there? Because obviously, as a journalist at the Warragul and Druin Gazette, you had written an article 4 years ago, I believe due to Anzac Day services being cancelled due to COVID, and you'd sort of put your story out there beforehand, and now, of course, you're talking to me today about your story. I guess, did you want to touch on the importance of keeping those Vietnam stories alive?
Oh, yeah, and I think these podcasts are a good start, not just for Vietnam, but there's been a hell of a lot happened that the Defence Force has been involved in peacekeeping, peacemaking, conflicts since Vietnam finished, what they call P75, post-1975. So the story I wrote in the paper was just a bit of editor pressure because there weren't going to be any reports on Anzac Day. Really, but it's the first time I've written anything about my experiences and as an individual, as a member of a unit and as a family that's had, 3 generations now of military service in 3 different services. And I won't write any more. I've read some books on Vietnam by guys who served there, and some from officers which are very tactical, strategic, and whatever, which to the average person wouldn't mean much and didn't mean a great deal to me either. And some of the guys' experiences who've written books on it, not the best book I've read on it was written by a bloke who reckoned if he got called up, he'd been a conscientious objector or whatever. It's called The Vietnam Years, and it's set it in one historical perspective from Vietnam, a social perspective that was going on in Australia, our involvement, and the politics around it, and everything, and a bit about the actions that went on and Australia's involvement, Australians' involvement in Vietnam, and for somebody who hasn't had any contact with it or contact with a person, close contact with a person who was there, it probably put it in the best perspective that I've seen. And sit back and I think, people who come in with an open mind, probably best to write about things like that. So I don't think I'll be writing much more, if any more.
No, well, we appreciate you taking the time to talk about your experiences today. On that is just about everything that I wanted to touch on. Were there any other points that you wanted to make, any stories that you had, anything at all that we haven't touched on that maybe might be worth a mention? No?
I've mentioned a lot of things I'd sort of forgotten about.
That's all right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Keith. I know from a personal perspective, I've certainly learnt a lot about Vietnam, and you as a bloke who I've been sitting next to at a desk for more than 2 years now. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us, and it's been genuinely a fascinating experience to hear.
Thank you.
No worries. The Warragul and Druin Gazette and the Warragul RSL would like to thank our guests for sharing their opinions and recollections of their service in Vietnam, as well as their later experiences after returning back into civilian life.